Good morning. I'm Kurt Suplee, a pre-owned journalist now working in a physical measurement laboratory, and it is my great privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michael Reardon. I met Michael the first time, 25 years ago or so, when he was at the what used to be called the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, and I, for my sins, was covering the physical sciences for the Washington Post. By then, Michael had already become a distinguished writer. He is a particle physicist and did his thesis at MIT on experiments providing early evidence for this then hypothetical thing called a quark. But in 1988, he sprang unaccountably to public notice by writing a book called The Hunting of the Quark, a true story of modern physics. And it's a wonderful book. It was recognized as such. About 8 seconds after it was published, it won the Science Writing Award from the American Institute of Physics. And I see it's still available on Amazon for prices that actually are above $1, which is more than you can say for my stuff. And he promptly continued as an historian to tackle ever increasingly complicated subjects. In 1991, he co-authored a book with the late astrophysicist David Schramm called Shadows of Creation, which was the first book for general audiences on invisible matter in the universe and so forth, and how they affect how they are affected by both particle physics and galaxy formation. Then in 1997, with co-author Lillian Hoddeson, he published what is my personal favorite book, The Crystal Fire, The Birth of the Information Age. And this remains, to this day, 20 years later, as the definitive history of the invention and development of the transistor at Bell Labs, and which led to the integrated circuit, which led to life as we know it. That, of course, won the 1998 Sally Hacker Prize of the Society for the History of Technology, but perhaps better known to you folks, it was adapted for the award-winning PBS documentary entitled Transistorized. Still very popular to this day. Now he's produced his most recent accomplishment, and which he will tell you about, but I will say that by the time the lecture is over, I think you will know why the American Institute of Physics, in a citation honoring Michael, said he was awarded for skillfully conveying the excitement and drama of science and for clarifying important scientific ideas through his books, articles, and many television programs. Reardon's work has enhanced the public's appreciation of physics as a source of beneficial applications and as an integral part of our intellectual life. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Reardon.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and you left out one important thing, which was when Kurt was getting the AAAS Science Writing Award, and I think, it was 1997, I met my future wife, Donna Reardon, who has changed my life entirely. So that's very, very significant. Let me see. All right. To begin with, in October 1993, the U.S. Congress terminated the Superconducting Supercollider, ending more than 4 decades of American leadership in high-energy physics. To be sure, U.S. hegemony in the field had been deteriorating for over a decade, but the SSC cancellation was the final blow that put Europe unquestionably in the driver's seat in high-energy physics, eventually leading to the discovery of the Higgs boson in 2012. At the Large Hadron Collider. The causes and consequences of this collapse, which was a watershed event in the history of science, have been discussed and debated ever since, and I'm going to give you my personal take on it today. I began discussions of it shortly. Let me begin by outlining what the SSC was for a number of you who are less familiar with it. This is a drawing from the SSC promotional literature about 1990. And in it you see a number of other colliders that were either in existence or being built at the time. CERN's Large Electron Positron Collider, 27 kilometers in circumference, I think had just begun colliding beams in 1989, 1990. The Stanford Linear Collider, 3 kilometers long. Fermilab's Tevatron, about 6 kilometers in circumference. And the SSC was an order of magnitude larger, 10 to 20 times larger and more costly, as it turned out, than anything the U.S. high-energy physics community, or in fact the European high-energy physics community, had attempted. The projects before that, the major new laboratories with the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, which costed in 1990 dollars, was about $550 million. The Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory, built between 68 and 72, was really about $750 million. The Large Electron Positron Collider, this machine here, which became the Large Hadron Collider when they put superconducting magnets in it in the early 2000s. That was, well, if you just use the European accounting methods, it was a $550 million project at an average exchange rate of 1.65, but that only included equipment. It included no labor. So if you were to include labor, double it. And in reality, it was about a $1 billion project. Now this machine, the SSC, was designed to reach 40 trillion electron volts. Most of you here, I assume, are familiar with electron volts, and I'm going to use the phrase TeV rather than trillion electron volts, but 10 to the 12th electron volts. And why did it have to be so high? Well, the thinking was that it was time to reach that TeV scale of new particles that you could produce. 1 TeV was then thought of as the likely mass of the Higgs boson, which was the principal target. And you're bringing 2 protons together. They're composite objects. As we know from the SLAC and other experiments, they're made of quarks and gluons. And if you bring 2 protons together, usually they miss. Occasionally you get a collision between a quark and one and then a quark and another, or a gluon in one and a gluon in the other. And the energy of that constituent collision is like 1/10 of the total energy. So a 40 TeV machine could get you up to the, say, 1 to 4 TeV range. That was really the rationale behind building such a large and expensive machine. Well, before I go ahead, let me say that I had discussions with, in the very early days, talking with Wolfgang Panofsky, we call him PEEF, about what had gone wrong. In 1999, 1993, 1994, we'd go into each other's offices, and one day he came into my office and sat down kind of dejectedly, and he said, maybe Jim Cronin was right, referring to the Nobel Prize winning physicist from Chicago. Maybe this was a bridge too far. All right, maybe the SSC was a bridge too far. And I was puzzled by the statement. I asked Jim Cronin, did he ever make that statement? He says, no, I never made that statement. Panofsky had a way of putting his own words in other people's mouths. All right. I later learned this was the title of a book in 1974 by Cornelius Ryan about an abortive Allied campaign during World War II, where British and American, I think some Polish paratroopers, dropped behind the German lines in 1944, I think it was September of 44, to try to capture and hold the Arnhem Bridge over the Rhine River while the support came up. While the support never came, it was a disastrous Allied campaign. You don't hear much about it in the U.S., but it was a big, in the British world, it was much discussed. There was a 1977 movie based on that, directed by David Attenborough. Anyway, so that's really where I got the title of my talk. And to really, dig into the causes, and we really have to go back to the beginning. This is a quote that Lillian Hodison, my co-author's husband, who was a professor of literature at University of Illinois, dug up and said, the first half of the book, really, we're digging there. So let's go back to the beginning. In 1982, the figure here in the middle, Leon Lederman, should be familiar to a lot of you. He was president of the AAAS, president of APS, Nobel Prize winner. And there was a lot of concern at the time that European high-energy physics was moving ahead with the Large Electron Positron Collider and leaving the United States to secondary status in a field that it had dominated for ever since World War II. And so he, along with others at a meeting in Snowmass, Colorado in July and early August of 1982, came up with what they called the Desertron, a very large machine, so large, using superconducting magnets, the technology that was then being proved out at the Fermilab Tevatron, so large that you could only build it in the American Southwest, hence the name Desertron. And the physicists came away from that meeting convinced that this was the way to reestablish U.S. leadership in high-energy physics, to get to the TeV range of particle interactions, interparticle interactions. Those other machines that I showed you could only get to the 100 millions of TeV, but 100 millions of GeV, of billion electron volts. But this machine could get to the TeV range. And Leon got a very strong ally in the Republican administration. Reagan's first science advisor, George Keyworth, a nuclear physicist from Los Alamos, who is considered, in science policy circles, he's considered to be a strong science advisor because he had one-on-one access to Reagan. As we know now, it was because of Star Wars, because of the Strategic Defense Initiative, for which after March of '83, after the announcement of SDI, he became one of the administration's chief spokesmen. Anyway, and he was aware of Ronald Reagan's love of large projects, and that he was also a great defender and believer in high-energy physics, as you can tell from the statement down here. Today, they are starved into a state of near intellectual malnutrition, meaning SLAC, Brookhaven, and Fermilab. During the Carter administration, the funding for high-energy physics in the new Department of Energy was either flat or declining because of the inflation that was going on in that period. And indeed, the field was falling behind Europe at the time, and Keyworth was determined to reverse that trend. The money was coming out of energy, renewable energy, solar energy, development and demonstration projects, $1 billion or so, which was real money back in those days. And it was really the Reagan administration's conception that we should refashion the DOE, which originally they wanted to kill, but they're going to refashion it as the Agency for Physical Sciences. Anyway, this all led to the Wojcicki sub-panel of the High Energy Physics Advisory Panel, which met in the first half of 1983, and they were charged to come up with a plan that is going to reestablish U.S. leadership in high energy physics, and they weren't given a total cost. He said in fact, Keyworth came to the first meeting, and he said, $1 to $2 billion is not too big an amount to think of as long as you could justify it by the physics. He told him to, quote, think big. And they also were charged to come up with a decision on what to do with the faltering Isabel project, the Colliding Beam Accelerator Isabel project at Brookhaven. Anyway, they came back and said, we proposed a machine called the Superconducting Supercollider. That name came out of that panel, with a proton beam energies of 10 to 20 TeV, meaning collision energies of 20 to 40 TeV. You have to double it because your two beams are colliding. Luminosity here, an estimated cost of, just like Keyworth had asked, $2 billion. And a few other things here. Well, that was accepted by the Department of Energy. It was accepted first by the full High Energy Physics Advisory Panel, and then by the Department of Energy, and that launched the establishment of the Central Design Group at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. About 100 physicists came and went, but I think about 40 of them actually were resident at the Lawrence LBL. Under Cornell accelerator physicist Maury Tigner, widely recognized as the best accelerator physicist of his era, of his age. And they came back after about a 2-year period with a 40 TeV proton collider, the very max of that 10 to 20, that 20 to 40 limit that the Wojcicki panel had specified. And I think part of the reason was that was that the Europeans decided that, no, we're not going to join this project. We're going to go and eventually put superconducting magnets in the LEP tunnel and have our own proton collider that can reach, the number was like 15 TeV back in those days. So I think there was a political component to this decision. It was justified on the physics. We need 40 TeV to do the physics, but there was a political component in that. If they came back and said, well, we want to build a 20 TeV machine, Congress would have said, well, why don't you just go and join those guys in Europe? They're building one that's about 5 TeV less. So it really had to be significantly higher and offer a lot more physics than one could do just by putting superconducting magnets in the tunnel. And he came back here in April of 1980. Oops, sorry. I always get confused with these buttons. Came back on April 1st, 1986, with a cost of $3.01 billion. This was a real bare bones, cut it, shave it, make it, we'll make it work eventually kind of design, which was a philosophy that was followed by Tigner and his mentor Robert Wilson at SLAC, and at Fermilab and other places. And one of the key items was that the dipole magnet aperture, so the size of the beam pipe going through the dipole and quadrupole magnets, was only 4 centimeters, which was recognized as really on the edge. In fact, a panel looked at that and said, you might need to go to 5 centimeters. And the cost of that might be $100 or $200 million more. So the DOE added $5 million to the contingency. All right. Anyway, that design is essentially what went to the Domestic Policy Council in December and January of 1987. By then, they put in the extra items like detectors and overheads and R&D and commissioning costs. The cost was $4.5 billion when presented here. And the Domestic Policy Council was divided. And in the first meeting, without Reagan there, it was like a 6-7 or 7-7 vote. I actually saw the vote in the Reagan archives, in the Keyworth files in the Reagan archives. So a second meeting had to occur in January. Here we see the director of the Office of Energy Research at DOE, now called the Office of Science, Alvin Trippelpiece, talking to Reagan, and here's George H.W. Bush, and the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, and the head of the Office of Management and Budget, James Miller III. He was pretty staunchly opposed to it because he didn't know where the money was going to come from. This is the era of the Graham-Redmond-Holling sequestrations. The government was running $100 to $200 million budgets, which was a large number back in those days, budget deficits, which was a large deficit back in those days. And he was opposed to it. Weinberger was, the Department of Defense was in favor of it. It really took Reagan to make the decision himself. And toward the end of the meeting, after Trippelpiece had finished, he pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. It was a poem that he'd been given by Oakland Raiders quarterback Kenny Stabler, well known for his game-ending Hail Mary passes into the end zone. And he read it was a Jack London poem. He read it, and somebody asked him, what does it mean? And Reagan said, throw deep, which was the signal that we're going to go ahead with this project as an American project. Well, Miller and the OMB put in a poison pill at that point, and I can't really point to any one person. But they specified, and it was included in the decision memo signed by Edwin Meese, that we would look for a 30% non-federal contribution to this thing, meaning from foreign nations, industry, states. 30% of the cost would have to come from outside the federal budget. Well, and then that very next day, Energy Secretary John Harrington held a press conference. He talked about the glorious superconducting supercollider, and he was asked about a question by a reporter saying, are we going to have foreign contributions to this thing? We have foreign partners, and Energy Secretary Harrington said, this is an American project, American leadership. We are going forward with it. And this is really a point. I'm going to talk about this being a fundamental flaw in the rhetoric, the initial rhetoric of the Super Collider, that this really was going to be a project to reestablish American leadership in high energy physics. And yes, we were going to look for foreign support, but it's basically an American project. Well, that kicked off a site selection process. A $4.5 million project could not just be sole sourced to Fermilab. That would have been dead on arrival. The Texas delegation would have risen up and said, no way, over our dead bodies. You had to have this site selection process. And the winning site, after about 18 months, after 40 sites had been winnowed down to 8, and then to the final one in November of 1988, just after the election, by the way, was Texas, Waxahachie, Texas, just south of the Fort Worth, Dallas Metroplex, which was judged excellent or good on all DOE criteria. Probably coming in second, although they didn't make a numerical listing, was the Illinois Fermilab site, which would have used a lot of the infrastructure from Fermilab and used the Fermilab Tevatron as an injector to boost the protons up to about 1 TeV. Received a poor rating on what was called setting because of opposition of local activists who were probably a minority of the vote. And there was an urgency to get this project launched before Reagan left office in January of 1989. And the opposition at Fermilab could easily have held this project up for years. Okay. And meanwhile, in late '88, the URA, the Universities Research Association, which I worked for in a year in 1991, a group of about 80 universities across the United States, and I think a couple in Canada. Yeah, you can see there's one in Montreal, or right there, had put together a management and operations proposal. They had to respond to a DOE request for proposals. It was not going to be given to URA normally, as it had been, like in the case of Fermilab. They had to compete for it. And in responding to that RFP, they decided that they had to team with major construction and operations management companies from the military-industrial complex, Sverdrup and EG&G. This met with great, with great cries of opposition from the high energy physics community, who doubted you could meld those two kinds of cultures, the military-industrial complex on the one hand, the high energy physicist on the other. Anyway, they went forward with it. In that proposal, there's an org chart. The URA had to specify 4 major leaders. They had to come up with the persons in the laboratory director position, which was Professor Roy Schwitters of Harvard University, who had distinguished himself in the discovery of the psi particle at SLAC, which had been the basis of Burton Richter's Nobel Prize. Maury Tigner, the designer of the machine, accepted temporarily a position as deputy director. Helen Edwards, who had built the Tevatron, or led the building of the Tevatron, was the head of accelerator systems. Robert Robbins from Sverdrup and conventional construction. Bruce Christman, the business manager from Fermilab, was the head of laboratory administrative services. Notably, there's nobody in the project manager position, arguably the second most important position, function on this org chart. Well, it turned out that most of these people were not there a year later. Tigner left a day or two after the contract was signed in January of '89 for URA to manage the project. He went back to Cornell. It's clear he didn't intend to stay on. And many of the people from, especially the top leaders of the Central Design Group, followed his example. Bruce Christman left after about 6 months, just getting the outlines of a management organization set up, went back to Fermilab. And Sverdrup, the company was tasked to do conventional construction, fell down on its knees, and Robert Robbins had to be removed. So really, there's only Schwitters and Helen Edwards was left after about 1 year. So I just love this picture. Here's Roy Schwitters standing in the middle of a fallow cotton field south of Dallas with a bunch of plans in his hands. And here in the center of town, Waxahachie. You can see Waxahachie in the middle of this ring right here. is the Romanesque Revival Courthouse, the most notable structure in Waxahachie to that date. And notice I choose this drawing because it shows the geology. The preferable geology, the preferable layer to tunnel in was the Austin Chalk here. Really easy to tunnel in that. Above that, Taylor Marl. And below that, the Eagle Ford Shale, which has become famous for other reasons, fracking in northern Texas right now. And so one of the first things to be done on coming down to the site was to come up with a site-specific design. Take this general design that Tigner and company had put together at CDG and meld it into the local setting, into the local geology. So one of the questions was, do we tilt the ring such that it fits inside the Austin Chalk? And they decided against it, that would lead to other engineering complexities, so they kept it on the plane. So that's an example of a site-specific design that had to be done. Well, in the process of doing the site-specific design, Helen Edwards came up with a lot of changes to make it a much more conservative design. Take out a lot of the risk in Maury Tigner's design, like increasing the aperture to 5 centimeters, increasing the booster energy from 1 TeV to 2 TeV. That's the energy the electrons get inserted into the main ring. Increasing the number of magnets and making them shorter, increasing their circumference. But that added, a rough estimate at that time in 89, October 89, was $1 to $2 billion to the cost. All right, the cost at that time had risen up to about $6 billion. That was what Congress approved when it gave it the green light. In September of '89, they approved a $5.9 billion cost. Well, when that news hit Washington, and it struck on the front page of the Washington Post in mid-November of '89, the new Secretary of Energy, Admiral James Watkins, who had been the commander of a nuclear submarine and a destroyer, had also been the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he just went livid. One of a high-ranking official in the Department of Energy who asked not to be named said the admiral had to be scraped off the ceiling. The admiral hated to be blindsided, even when the news was good. He wanted to know ahead of time when something was going to appear on the front page of the Washington Post. And so he decided that these long-haired academic physicists were incapable of managing such a large project on their own, and he would bring in some of his people from the nuclear navy, who had all gotten their training under Hyman Rickover, as he did, and to help on the project. And one of the persons he brought in was Edward Siskin, who he had installed as the general manager, the number 2 person in the whole project, reporting directly to Roy Schwitters, and all of the collider construction was under him. And he indeed had a very extensive resume. He'd worked as executive vice president of Stone and Webster, rescuing multi-billion-dollar nuclear reactor projects, was what he was really well known for. And another person that the Admiral put in the hierarchy of the management structure was Joseph Cipriano, who was head of advanced weapons procurement for the Navy in the Pentagon, who was procuring somewhere between $10 and $15 billion worth of advanced weapon systems. He sent them down. He came down there in May, took over the DOE site office. He was an associate director, same status as Trivial-Peace had had. He was not a political appointee. He was he was at the same level as those reporting to Trivial-Peace had. And the Cipriano would send bi-weekly memos to let the admiral and those who worked with him know what's going on at the laboratory. So he had a direct reporting line to the admiral there. Here's one in September of 1990. That's about the time that Siskin was stepping in, and they're talking about the wrestling, who's going to control the architect, engineer, construction management contract. Was it going to be DOE or was it going to be URA? All right, and here we see the hand of the admiral here, nuts. Whoop. And those of you who are military historians know where that came from. And we say Hinson Moore, the Deputy Secretary of Energy, signing off here, and then delegating some authority to his assistant, Jay Stone. So this is not just an information memo, this is a management tool. And sending the word through the Forrestal, the headquarters of the DOE, is how we're going to actually manage this project. Try to take the control away from the physicists who shown they can't manage it. Well, I came to Washington in 1991, early 1991. By that time, the dust had settled. There had been 4 separate attempts to evaluate the cost of this thing, with cost levels coming in from $7.84 billion up to one by the independent cost estimating staff known as ICE, $11.8 billion. And the DOE compromised toward the low end, and they came up with the official value, $8.25 billion here. And notice it shows this 30% non-federal contribution up here as a target. And by that time, with the price up to 8.25, we know they needed something like $2.7, $2.8 billion of non-federal. Well, the state of Texas had put in $1 billion. Actually, it came down to $875 million. So they were really needing close to $2 billion of foreign contributions on this project to make it work. And if they didn't materialize, then the yearly costs were going to exceed $1 billion in the mid-1990s to be borne by the U.S. taxpayer. Well, still, in May of 1991, there was a vote. There was an amendment entered by Jim Slattery of Kansas to kill the SSC, maybe keep $40 million in the budget to shut it down. That was defeated by what I thought was a comfortable margin of 251 to 165. All right. But notice, there was a distinct north-south pattern in the voting. It was not partisan, Republican versus Democrat. It was more geographical. It was Rust Belt versus Sun Belt, particularly the 4 states around Fermilab. All voted against it. New England and New York were not very favorable, given that Brookhaven had to kill its major project. And then there's a Plain State opposition, which I don't really understand. Okay, but I thought that was pretty comfortable. I went back to SLAC in late 1992, thinking, well, this thing is in good shape. It had solved its project manager problem after having 2 project managers and 3 acting project managers. Finally, in December of 1991, John Reese, who had extensive project management experience at SLAC, but at the $100 million scale, had agreed to step in as project manager in January. And he worked really well with Siskin. He had his own military background in the U.S. Navy. He had served out in Germantown in the DOE offices, the program offices, during the construction of Fermilab. He knew the need of the bureaucrats to have good information that they could take to Congress and make sure that Congress was on board with the project, understood that it was under control, things like that. And so working together, Reese and Siskin, Reese getting the buy-in from the physicists, Siskin really doing the mechanics, leading a team of 70, got this project management control system, a computerized system, under some kind of establishment. It still wasn't fully proved out, but between Siskin and Reese, they really began to get this project under control in 1992. Well, many people use this phrase, but it's been largely attributed to New York Congressman Sherwood Boehlert, one of the principal opponents. Congressional support for the Super Collider was a mile wide and an inch deep. I heard that repeatedly in 1991. Here's Boehlert, kind of a grainy picture of him in those years. He eventually became the chair of the House Science Committee in the 1990s. And the other principal opponent, who usually entered the amendments to kill it, Jim Slattery of Kansas. And lo and behold, in June 1992, and I'm now back at SLAC, lightning strikes the SSC. There was a vote, again, on a Slattery, it might not have been an amendment, to 232 to 181 to kill the SSC. And what's remarkable about this, it's really the same members who had voted to approve it the previous year. Okay? But notice the extensive, now essentially the whole Rust Belt is against the project. Even the Sun Belt support is breaking down. California's gone against it. Half of the states in the southeast are now against it. And 70 members changed their vote. This is basically the same Congress. There was no elections in between this. They changed their vote, which is not an ordinary thing to do in Congress. At least in those days, Congress approved of science, both sides of the aisle. It provided jobs. It improved technology. And it would eventually lead to economic benefits. And so they didn't want to be seen as opposing a project in science. So it's surprising that they did change their minds. My own Congressman, Leon Panetta, one of the chief public servants of our time, as it turned out, who was then the chairman of the Budget Committee in the House, said to me in a phone interview in 2005, when he was back in the district, the SSE had become the poster child for congressional pork. You got to take this seriously. This guy has been in the Clinton administration, the head of the OMB, chief of staff in the White House. He took some time off in the Obama administration, he was head of the CIA, and then the Secretary of Defense. I can only think of maybe Robert Gates as having had more public service than Leon Panetta. He switched his vote and became a staunch opponent. Why? Well, because of one of the leaders of this balanced budget, there was a balanced budget amendment that had been entered the previous week and voted upon in a bitter contest. And one of the leaders was of that campaign was the Republican congressman from the SSC's district, Joe Barton, seen here on a visit to the SSC in July 1992. And also in this picture, you can see the President's Science Advisor, Alan Bromley, there's Bush himself, and Roy Schwitters, the director, showing them a series of magnets about to be tested in what was called the string test. Bush, remember, was fighting for his political life. He had to win Texas. There was another Texan named Ross Perot that could easily have taken that state away from him. So he came down and made a big thing about the need for high energy physics and the U.S. leadership in the field. But the one who really resolved the problem, who saved the SSC that year, was Louisiana Senator J. Bennett Johnson, shown here at SLAC that fall, talking to, here's Sidney Drell, and here down in this corner, Wolfgang Pief Panofsky, the person I mentioned very early. And Johnson was a chair of both the Energy and Natural Resources Committee and the Energy and Water Subcommittee that had authority over the budget for energy and water projects throughout the land. A position that does not occur. He was enormously powerful, and he engineered a vote of 62 to 32 to defeat a similar amendment to kill the SSC in the Senate. So the House and the Senate leaders got together. They had what's called the conference committee. They decided to keep the SSC in the budget at a slightly reduced level. That went to the full House, the full Senate, and was approved. And the SSC got life for another year. Well, so here you see the project in early 1993. Most of the buildings then erected were the SSC North Campus. We see the Magnet Development Laboratory, the Magnet Test Laboratory. Here's a long building in which Bush and Schwitters were walking. There was what was called the accelerator system string test, where 5 superconducting dipoles and 2 quadrupoles all linked together had to work simultaneously, go up to 6,500 amperes and actually function. And that test was successful, allowing the tunneling to begin. So you can see that the entry tunnel down here, and if you were to look up from the bottom, this is what it looks like, and the tunneling is beginning of the main ring in early 1993. But tectonic forces were at work in the U.S. political system. That fall, in that November elections, Bush lost the election to Clinton, who only had 43% of the popular vote. But more importantly, I think, was the fact that 114 new congressmen and congresswomen had come in, and many of them campaigning on getting the budget back in balance. And I think there were 13 new senators who have come in, having similarly campaigned. So, balancing the budget was, for one of the few times in congressional history, a very important criterion that year. And okay, here's a photograph of a Clinton at a press conference after a summit meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa. But let me first begin by pointing to the people that are in the lineup over here. You can't really see Clark, let's see, Warren Christopher right here. But here's the new Secretary of the Treasury, former Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen. And to back up in time a bit, from April of 1993, there had been a meeting at Camp David to decide how are we going to get the budget back in control, at which Leon Panetta said, let's zero out the super collider. And Bentsen, being the Secretary of Treasury, very powerful position, said no, and being a Texan. So they compromised and kept it in the budget at $640 million, but stretched out, they were going to stretch out the time scale. This was this famous Clinton stretch out for 2 or 3 years, but that would add at least $1 billion to the cost of having an army marching in place. It was going to add to the cost. It was understood, but that would keep the total costs below that $1 billion level, give the foreign partners time to make up their minds and contribute. Particularly, they were particularly aiming at Japan at the time, which was kind of dragging its feet, but I think was ready to say yes. But the topic never came up at that meeting as a unidentified source, but in a press access after the meeting. So one of the reporters asked, "Did the SSC ever come up?" And that person said, "No, it never came up." What was really important was rebalancing the U.S.-Japan trade. Rebalancing U.S.-Japan trade. And here you notice this is Mickey Kanner is there, the U.S. trade representative. And I think this is Richard Lacey, and that's, of course, Robert Rubin. You don't see the Secretary of Energy, Hazel O'Leary, here. You don't see the science advisor, Jack Gibbons. So you can say that clearly science was not on the table at this discussion. But here, after that, about just before I sent the book to the publisher, I found this memo that had surfaced in the Clinton archives because of a FOIA request on Secretary O'Leary's file. And here's a memo from, there's a name you should recognize, John Podesta, then the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Chief of Staff, Mac McLarty, and say the National Security Council is raising objections to this project because, for various reasons, including a letter would be seen as suggesting that we attached greater importance to the Japanese participation in the SSC than we do to Japanese efforts on other fronts, like aid to Russia. There was a letter that Hazel O'Leary's office had initiated to be a letter from Clinton to Miyazawa specifically requesting $1.5 billion, but it could not get the National Security Council to sign off, and Jack Gibbons, in a separate document, a separate letter about 3 weeks earlier, said, I can't sign off on this thing. So it gives you an idea of how important this project had risen and what it was competing against. And I haven't even mentioned all the opposition from the physicists in material science, solid-state physics, the so-called small scientists, although I use that phrase guardedly, and especially in this audience. And then let me cite you another. I was talking to Richard Barth, who was a PhD chemist on the National Security Council staff, about this and other things. And he said, it always sticks in my mind, he said, Michael, you're talking about something that is of great interest to 3,000 high-energy physicists compared to something that's of interest to 300,000 auto workers. Namely, one of the things that the U.S. was pressing the Japanese for at that time was quotas on auto parts. And the Japanese hated it. And if the golden handshake was ever to occur between the premier and the president, then the U.S. was going to have to go soft on these trade things like quotas on auto parts, and Clinton was unwilling to take that stance. So this thing went to Congress without, that year, without such a commitment from the Japanese. Their costs continued to rise, and now it was pretty clear it was going to go over $10 billion, which was a watershed for members of the House. And we saw the same scenario play out. The House voted it down in June. The Senate rescued it in September. The conference committee kept it in the budget at the president's request of $640 million. And then we had a vote in October of 1993 on the entire energy and water bill. A motion was entered to refer it back to the conference committee with instructions to delete the superconducting supercollider. And it won by a resounding, almost a 2-to-1 margin. You can see that essentially all of the United States, except for a cluster of states around Texas and Louisiana, and right here in the D.C. area, the rest of the country was uniformly against it. At that point, when Senator Johnson threw in the towel, the Senate could not withstand the will of the House, and they agreed to close it down, but to use the $640 million to do so in an orderly fashion. Okay. Well, let me wrap up. I see I'm still within my time here. In retrospect, the Department of Energy and the high energy physics community faced two really daunting tasks. One was to build the physical infrastructure for such a huge project, 54 miles in circumference, costing $10 billion, let us say, in what was a greenfield site where they would have to essentially bring in most of the human infrastructure. All right, the physicists, the engineers, the support staff. One of the things that Sverdrup and AG&G were supposed to do was to tap into this pool of labor from the military-industrial complex, which was winding down in the closing days of the Cold War, and get that in place and working. But unfortunately, it established kind of an alien culture. And there was a lot of back and forth battling that was going on at the SSC. It was not conducive to building a world-class high energy physics laboratory. And it also led to additional costs. We can't really put a firm number on it, but our guess is that the additional cost of building up that human infrastructure, never mind all the buildings, was about $1 billion. Now add that to the savings that could have been achieved by putting the laboratory at Fermilab, which the DOE did and evaluate that, which was like $500 million to $1 billion. You're talking about the added cost of $1.5 to $2 billion to put the project in Texas, at least. All right, and that was not part of the thinking when they decided on the Texas site. So, to wrap it all up, my three principal reasons that this was indeed a bridge too far for the high energy physics community. The cost of the project was grossly underestimated, continued to rise to the point where there was no credibility in any figure, not 10.45, not 11, not $12 billion. John Reese, the project manager, said to me in an interview, he says, this thing could have easily gone to $15 billion. Right? But the US physicists, the high energy physicists, had grabbed at Reagan's throw deep, think big, or actually keywords, think big. But such a large-scale project requires political compromises. The U.S. high energy physics community does not have the so-called political capital to maintain such a project. So, and those of you in the Washington area understand the meaning of that term. For example, when Clinton came to office with only 43% of the popular vote, he didn't have the political capital that he needed to do a lot of things like healthcare initiatives. And he wasn't going to squander it on a Republican project in Texas. I mean, he was lukewarm about it, said it's good science, but he wasn't going to get behind it and jawbone and campaign for it. So the community itself had to rely on political capital like the military-industrial complex. But there were compromises involved in that. Watered down the project, watered down the support for it, made it appear as if it was a high-tech jobs project for Texas and Louisiana rather than a project to reestablish U.S. leadership in a scientific field. Now, and my second theme is that was the foreign contributions did not come in, and not at the size that were needed for this project. And there was this fundamental flaw in the founding rhetoric, that we're going to design and build this project to reestablish leadership U.S. leadership in high energy physics, but we're going to expect, our friends in other nations to help us pay for it. Especially in Europe. Europe did not buy into that argument. The numbers that were required, the amounts of money that were required, could not be accommodated within the normal budgets of foreign ministries that did high energy physics. Therefore, it required decisions at a much higher level in the hierarchy. It became a political project. It required, Prime Minister Miyazawa to say, yes, okay, I will go ahead with you, but you've got to trade that off and go easy on things like auto parts. By the 1980s, other nations expected to be treated as equal partners in major scientific projects. And I point to the current LIGO project and the discovery of gravity waves as a shining success of that approach to international projects. The third thing was that the Cold War was ending. The Roy Schwitters came to town with the news that the project was going to need another $2 billion on November 9th, 1989. Anybody know what happened on November 9th, 1989? That's the day that Berlin Wall fell. All right, and by 1991, the Soviet Union, by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union, USSR no longer existed. John Krige, a historian now he was the chief CERN historian, but now he's in Georgia Tech, coined a phrase called civil security. All right, that during the Cold War, it was not just a matter of having the best military. This was a battle for the hearts and minds of the Third World, then called the Third World. In such a battle, you wanted to have the best athletes, you wanted to have the best astronauts, and you wanted to have the best high energy physicists. Congress couldn't tell what was the best physics. They relied on the scientists to come to them and say, this is the best physics, and we need this in order to win the Nobel Prizes. And that's what the high energy physicists did. But there were a lot of other physicists from, solid-state physics, condensed matter physics, material science, such as Phil Anderson, Ted Ball, Leon Cooper, who are coming and saying, no, the high energy physics is not the only field that you need to be supporting at this level. Another thing that was happening after the Cold War ended was that the basic research funding in the physical sciences was kind of leveling off or declining. That boost that came during the Reagan years did not occur. The boost was really occurring in the 1990s in environmental issues, climate change, and in health. Here to finish up, now I discovered this letter, this dear colleague letter, and I think this is what Panofsky was referring to when he said Cronin had argued this was a bridge too far. He was arguing in this letter that this project should really be sited at Fermilab, and I agree with that. But he did not recognize the reality of the U.S. political process. He did not know at that time that the opposition around Fermilab was a deciding factor in the DOE's rejection of the Illinois site. But he recognized that putting this thing at Fermilab would have been crucial to the health of the United States high energy physics project. Well, what could they have done? Well, there actually was a project that was on the table for the Wojcicki panel, a dedicated collider. It was entirely within the site at Fermilab, and therefore would not have had this problem of the local opposition. But it could only reach 2 TeV and 2 TeV, a total of 4 or maybe 5 energy, and its luminosity was pretty low. And the Wojcicki panel, I think rightfully deemed this project was insufficient. You're not going to get to the TeV scale. Maybe you can get up to 500 GeV, or half a TeV, but not to the full TeV scale needed to discover the Higgs boson. Well, unfortunately, the Higgs boson showed up a lot lower in energy. And there was an improvement of this thing, an upgrade that was discussed in a paper by Li Teng in March of '88, that if you use the superconducting magnets for the super collider, this thing could have reached 6 TeV. And the same luminosity that the SSC had. And my contention is that this project probably could have discovered the 120 GeV Higgs boson many years ago. Yeah. But here's the thing, it's two different approaches to doing these large projects. One is the gradual, keep upgrading in place, do what you can. The other one is to take this big leap over the European opposition, which big expensive leap over the opposition. And the United States took the second approach. And finally, to close it off, I was having breakfast at the Cosmos Club with my friend and then Vice President of University's Research Association, Ezra Heidewitt, and he points over the next table and says, "Hey, that's John Deutsch. Would you like me to introduce you to him?" So I said, "Sure, I'd like to meet John Deutsch," who had been Undersecretary of Energy, I think, in the Clinton administration. Later, I think, in the Carter administration. In the Clinton administration, I think he was the head of the CIA, and then briefly Secretary of Defense. So, sure, I want to meet him. And Ezra says, "This guy's writing a book about the super collider." And so Deutsch says, "Why, I wrote a memo about that when I was on the Board of Overseers in 1984, saying that this must be an international project from day one. And if you don't find that memo and publish it in your book, I'm going to find every copy I can, buy them up, and burn them." Luckily, I found the memo in the Keyworth archives, and it's in the conclusion of our book. And you can actually buy copies of it. He didn't go out and burn them all. And if you want to get this thing was published by the University of Chicago Press last November. It's been getting good reviews. If anybody's interested, there are brochures, flyers around. And on the back table, that can get you a 25% discount. And thank you very much for hearing me out. I guess there's time for questions. You're supposed to come to there we go. I got at least one question. Go ahead. You need the mic on over here. There you go.
Okay. You only mentioned in passing at the beginning Isabel project, but that was our previous next big accelerator, and in fact it used superconducting magnets, which after some initial promising results, they struggled for, I don't know, 6 or 8 years to make a large number of the magnets work, and that was a failure. So in light of that, can you just comment, and the project was terminated, and that was considered quite a big failure for DOE. So can you just comment on how it was that in light of the previous DOE project involving superconducting, going to superconducting magnets for the first time was a big failure, how that got sold on a much larger scale afterwards?
Well, to borrow a phrase from John Rees, the superconducting dipole magnets were the book of Job for the high energy physics community. All right, they wrestled with them at Fermilab, finally got them to work. They wrestled with them at Brookhaven. These are the dipole, long 17 meters. And I think they really had solved those problems. They had a design that was going to work. But by then, in 1982, it was, well, actually, by then, the W and Z bosons, which were really major targets of the Brookhaven Collider, the Isabel Collider, had been or were about to be discovered at CERN. Okay, so the physics rationale to continue that project was kind of evaporating. There were still, the other things to discover, like the top quark, which people then thought was going to come in around 60 GeV and eventually came in at 175, but nobody knew that at the time. Still, it was deemed not sufficient to keep that project going. I personally think that, with hindsight, a path not taken would be to keep the Brookhaven, the Isabel project going, and do the dedicated collider, and really learn how to make superconducting magnets before we go jumping on ahead to a multi-billion-dollar project involving superconducting magnets.
Can you also just make a quick comment on whether you see ITER as another example of things management and
okay, I want to give
finances getting out of hand?
Back to that. I want to give other people, yes, I have. That's something I'm often asked, but I want to give other people a chance. How about over here?
Yeah, hi. So one of the things I remember from the era is that the project was advertised to the general public as being crucial for the advancement of technology. I think part of the reason that there was so much opposition to that from, shall we say, condensed matter, solid-state physics community was that many of the advances, such as computer chips, lasers, fiber optics, which made the information age, had nothing to do with high energy physics, right? I mean, nuclear power, nuclear energy is from that era. Beyond that, maybe not so much. Maybe some of the advanced medical imaging comes out of that community.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, okay.
Okay, I mean, I'd agree with that. Nicholas Bloembergen stood up at, I think it was some congressional hearing, and objected to the high energy physicists taking credit for the advances that made MRI possible, the superconducting magnets. And indeed, not the case. What they could lay claim to is that, and even with frame of that, is, of driving the technology forward by being a major procurer and pushing the niobium titanium technology to the point where it would come down steeply in cost and become available. They could take credit for that, I think, and there was an article to that effect. But being the originator of a lot of these things, I don't think there's a very good argument there. But they lost points on that.
I can remember having a number of conversations, at the time with lay people, should we say, where they would say, "Gee, it's a lot of money, and I guess we need to do it for the technology." And I would say, "Oh, it's kind of a science culture project," and they would say, "Gee, that's a bad idea."
Okay, I would agree. I think it was that. I think the whole technological spin-off argument, I think, lost the SSC more points than it gained. But it was one that Congress could understand. And then Congress, especially the Texas Congress, would trumpet it and lose support for the SSC in the process. And when we go over here.
So in early 1900s, I was a graduate student, and a lot of my friends were in high energy physics, designing detectors and systems for SSC, and doing computer simulations, right? And so a couple of years after that, their career in physics disappeared, and a large number of them went to New York and London and did computer simulations in finance, which they knew a lot about computer simulations, but they were told what to simulate, and that, for instance, as one of them told me, didn't include negative depreciation of real estate. And so I think it would have been much cheaper to pay for SSC, keep them employed.
I agree. Indeed, when the SSC went down, I think there were about 2,000 employees, maybe several hundred of them high energy physicists, and maybe only 100 or 200 could be absorbed back into the community at the other laboratories, at the universities, and go to CERN and work on projects there. And some of them went to Wall Street and became what became known as quants.
Right, exactly.
All right, the people that really, the Black-Scholes algorithm was largely computerized by high energy physicists. Okay, so I agree. Let's see, take one over there.
I wanted to ask about what you labeled as the poison pill, this need to get some large fraction of the money from outside sources, because it reminded me of another major science project that has that kind of constraint today. And you contrasted that with LIGO, which is a much more equal partnership, international partnership type of project. So do you have a sense of whether this model of a largely US-led project, but with contributions from other countries, as being generally successful or not successful, or, is there a general pattern here to be?
I think it's a question of scale. All right, at the scale of LIGO, which is roughly $1 billion project. Okay, and I think Barry Barish, I haven't studied it in enough detail, but I'm going to be seeing him in late March. He's coming to Orcas Island, where I live, to give a lecture about LIGO. But I think the approach he took, which was to, there's the LIGO laboratory, where you're building the facility, And that's got to be responsible to the agency and eventually to Congress. And that's probably where most of the money is going. And then he set up the LIGO, the Scientific Collaboration, which is a genuine international project. And I haven't looked at the finances, but I'll bet that more than half, much more than half, came from either the money or the components or the labor came from foreign, and that's a genuine international collaboration, and I think that's the way to do it. And I just had discussions with Jim Sigrist up at the DOE. He's the head of the high energy physics office there. He said that's the approach they're taking on the long baseline neutrino facility. I mean, some of that has got to, some of that sits at Fermilab. Another part of that's going to sit out in South Dakota, all right? But ultimately, that part has to be responsible to Congress, and that part is principally American. But the scientific, the detector collaboration in Dune is like 75% foreign, or at least intended to be. And I think that really seems to work. Did I answer your question?
That's very insightful, yeah.
Take one over here.
My recollection when the SSC was terminated, that not only did they stop it, but they filled in the tunnel so that it couldn't be used in the future to resurrect the SSC or for anything else. And it struck me at the time as being particularly vindictive, you know, like driving a stake through the heart of the SSC after having buried it. And I was wondering whether, well, am I remembering that right? And is there a more generous interpretation of filling in the tunnel?
There was definitely some vindictiveness to it, okay? And I think led by New York Congressman Sherry Bullard. But they didn't fill in the entire tunnel. What they did is they took some of the tunneling spoils and just dropped them down those entry tunnels, you know, such that, you know, it'd fill it up and leak out into the tunnels. The rest of it is probably filled up with water by now. And there would be a little bit of a volcano at the top because the center would cave in a little bit. And I went and actually visited about a year later, and indeed, that was kind of the low-cost way of doing it. They had $640 million, which to close down the project. A lot of that went to compensate the state of Texas for its investment, which was like, I think by then was about $300 million. And then the rest was used to actually shut down the project. Okay?
I seem to recall that when SSC was being considered to be shut down, there was a lot of negative publicity about the management, excessive spending for things like flowers and other perks, and I think that, I was wondering if that really played a role in the decision to terminate it.
That's a multi-layer question. I would agree. There certainly was a lot of press about mismanagement, but I think the mismanagement really occurred on a much larger scale. I think, you know, for example, Roy Schwitters could have leaned a lot more heavily upon Helen Edwards to say, hey, you know, we don't have that largesse to count on to go another $2 billion. You got to cut back here. And, for example, do you really need to go to both increase the aperture and increase the injection energy? Choose one. All right. The other thing is that I think the management, I think that's bringing in the military industrial engineers into the project could have worked, that we needed the tools that they had and the community did not have, such as this cost and schedule control system approach. But they needed to be managed and you know, report to the director. Because of this second line of management that the Admiral set up, it was a very loose management structure. You didn't know who you were reporting to. So I think those were the things, not, you know, flowers in the thing. I mean, one of the things they did was they got an old, their dilapidated warehouse and converted it into offices. So, you know, yeah, why not a few potted plants to make it a decent place to work? I thought that was a stab in the back from some of the congressional staffers who would go to no length to try to undermine the project. I don't think it is a legitimate criticism.
I'm just saying that criticism, as opposed to the technical things that you mentioned, is something that strikes the public's nerve,
Yeah,
and they
yeah.
can appreciate and say, oh, there's wasteful spending.
This was John Dingell's, you know, in full form.
Yes, I seem to recall that the International Space Station was getting off the ground about the time the SSC was shut down. What, if any, role did that play in the decision to shut down the SSC?
Good question. And we never quite resolved it. There were Texans who claimed that Texas Governor Ann Richardson had been offered, a compromise or offered a choice by Clinton. He said, you got both the super collider and major expenses for the space station in your state, like at the Houston Research Center. She said, well, in that case, I'm going to decide in favor of the space station. But I can never find any real concrete evidence for that, just rumors. In fact, I saw statements contrary to that. Okay, but yes, you had two large projects. The space station budget was swelling to something like $30 billion, I think, before they downsized it. I don't know what it was getting $2 to $3 billion per year in funding in NASA. So that inevitably would have pressed on the SSC to some extent, because when the Office of Management Budget puts together the president's budget every year, that's where the balancing goes between those kinds of items, not in Congress. And there probably some horse trading that went on in the White House at the previous year while making the president's budget. Okay, we have more over here.
Are you going to talk about ITER or ITER?
Okay, ITER. I think ITER faces the same problems as the SSC at a much larger international scale. You really need to build an accelerator or any large project like this effectively. You need a strong core group of managers and engineers and technicians who can specify and say, we need you to design this particular component this way. All right, they can say this is a bad design or this is a good design. You need the test and evaluation effectively. And in both cases, you had to set up that infrastructure at a greenfield site. And I think there was this loose early management of ITER that did not achieve that goal. And so in fact, the design is still not, finished. It's still evolving. And when that happens and you've got your army marching in place, the costs go up. I think that happened in both cases. I think it really argues in favor of doing these large projects at existing laboratories where you have that human infrastructure in place where people know how to work together. You've got the expertise. For example, at SLAC was really good on detector building, detector design. And, yes, input is coming in from all the universities, et cetera, but you have people like one of the guys, Marty Bryan, back there that know what is going to make a really effective particle detector or, fusion reactor or accelerator. That was not in place in Texas. I don't think it was in place early on in ITER. It may now be finally forming under Bernard Brigeault, but I don't know enough about that project to say so. Enough? Okay. All right. But that's it. I think we'll go on.